Hi there, I'm Heather Shertia, the Executive Director of Digital Wish, and I am joined by Brian Stephens, the Director of Client Solutions for Funds for Learning, one of the premier experts on E-rate and the new ECF money that's coming down the pipeline. There is $7 billion coming down fast and furious from the federal government in these stimulus packages. Brian, tell us about that. Give us a brief overview. What's the big picture look like for this $7 billion?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So the Emergency Connectivity Fund basics is the part of the American Rescue Plan Act. One of the things to come out of that was the creation of what was called the Emergency Connectivity Fund. It's a little more than $7 billion in a one-time program that is really targeted at narrowing the homework gap. It's a funding source for K-12 schools and public library systems, and it funds off-campus internet connectivity and connected learning devices.
Yeah, that's unique. I have never in my career, we are a nonprofit on a mission to solve the digital divide. We care about hotspots, laptops, getting those kids connected at home, getting across the digital divide, and COVID has shown such a light on it. We have never seen this level of funding come down the pipeline for students at home. It's fantastic. Yeah, what led to that legislation coming down the pipeline? How did it happen? Is it just, COVID closing schools? What's the big picture?
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. I think that connectivity, internet connectivity, the pandemic brought that to light. The idea of the homework gap or the learning gap, if you want to call it that, certainly not a new idea. We all knew that there were students and teachers that were not connected when they left school for the day. But I think that when collectively we as a country went home, starting in around March 2020, I think people started to really understand the true impact of connectivity and what can happen if it's inadequate.
We did a survey when COVID first hit, and our survey showed that 11 million students didn't have a connection at home. So when COVID closed schools down, those kids were literally left with paper packets or trying anything to keep up with their education. So this is an absolute windfall. I am terrified that the money is not going to get applied for. Talk about that application window. It is going to happen over the summer when schools are out of session.
It's coming soon. Yeah. So this is an emergency program, and all of the legislation and all of the regulations behind it really sort of address that from that perspective. They want to move, and they want to move quick. And so the rules for the program have been approved. The FCC has issued an order. We have the basic framework, the structure, and the regulations. So the next thing that will happen is they will open an application window for schools to submit applications to apply for this funding. We expect that to happen sometime around the 1st of July, first week of July, perhaps. The official date as of today, it's June 8th. I'm just checking. So as of today,
less than a month away.
That's the big thing, so we don't know, but all indications are that it will open very soon, within a matter of weeks here. And once the application window opens, it will run for 45 days. So schools and libraries across the country will have 45 calendar days to log in, submit their applications for funding.
Let's talk about a little bit about those rules. You said schools and libraries. Now we get a lot of universities asking us, oh, can I apply? Or I'm a public library, can I apply? Where are those parameters? Where's the edge of the qualification?
That's a great question. So the short answer to the question is, if you're eligible for E-rate, you're eligible for ECF. The somewhat longer answer to that is that for schools, it's K-12 only. So you need to be recognized by your state as a provider of elementary or secondary education. It does include private schools and charter schools, as long as they meet that definition, provided that they run on a nonprofit basis and have an annual endowment of less than $50 million. But unfortunately, it does not extend to higher education. It is exclusively a K-12 program only. And public libraries are eligible to participate as well.
Public libraries are, okay. So school libraries and public, great. Talk about what you can purchase and how you get to that point. So in some of the previous webinars we've done, I asked the question, what do I have to do to prepare? And two things have come out. One is get your vendors in line and get your bids. And two is figure out what the need is. So let's say I have got my vendors in line. I know I did my need. I know exactly how many hotspots I need, and I know what they're going to cost. How much of that cost is actually going to be reimbursed, and for what, by the government?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So, although it shares many similarities with the E-rate program, there are some pretty significant differences. And one of those is in the funding levels. So for ECF, there is no funding cap, no overall funding cap, meaning that any given school or library can request as much money as they need for eligible products and services. Also, by and large, the full cost of those products and services is covered by this program, irrespective of socioeconomic level or the percentage of kids in a school district, for example, that qualify for free lunches. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that. The program does pay for laptop computers and tablets and connected learning devices. There's a $400 per device limit on those. So if a device costs $379, the full cost is covered. If it costs $479, the program pays $400 and the school pays the additional $79. The same thing is true of the hotspot hardware. So getting kids connected to the internet with like LTE or 5G hotspots. The hotspot hardware itself has a $250 cap on the hardware. However, the service to that device is not capped. They can pay the full cost of that service.
So there's laptop funding, there's hotspot funding, and then there's service funding, no cap on the service funding.
Exactly, yeah. And in addition to hotspot service, this program actually will fund additional types of internet connectivity to the home. So we do expect to see some residential broadband services funded through this program, things like DSL, cable modems, some types of wireless connectivity. It's actually sort of platform agnostic. If there's a way to get a kid connected to the internet at home, then generally the monthly service charges for that service should be eligible.
Well, let's talk, the rules are a little bit different for ECF than they are for E-rate. Talk about the percentage levels of reimbursement. So you're saying it's 100% reimbursement no matter what your free and reduced lunch percentage is? Because that's not how regular E-rate works, right?
That's correct. Yeah. So in the E-rate program, it's a discount program. So it's providing a discount, and the level of discount is based on the percentage of students in a school district that qualify to participate in the National School Lunch Program, the free and reduced lunch program run by the USDA. In the case of ECF, everybody's on equal footing. So these services are just 100% reimbursed up to those caps that I talked about, per device caps. Other than that, the full cost is covered regardless of whether you have a relatively low number of kids in free and reduced lunches or relatively high.
So it's just based on need. How do you have to assess that need? What do you have to show the government in order to say, I've got 59 students that do not have connectivity, and here's exactly how I know that's to be true? Is it, is it a survey at school registration day? Is it SurveyMonkey? Is it, Becky in the 3rd grade class hasn't been able to connect for 6 months, and now, I just surveyed my teachers and they said, there's this, Mrs. Jones has 17 kids, Mr. Paul's got 63 kids who aren't connected, and we know just because we've been doing this for a while. Or how does that happen? What's the burden of proof?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's a question that a lot of schools are wrestling with right now, because it's really sort of interesting the way the FCC approached this. There's a requirement. So on the application itself, you have to make a certification. And the certification says that you're only requesting funding for students or staff members for connections or devices that they would otherwise not have a connection or a device sufficient to engage in remote learning. So there's not necessarily like an income level requirement or anything like that. What they're saying is that, does this student here have an internet connection that's adequate for remote learning? Yes or no? If the answer is no, then that, the funding can flow for getting that student connected. Same thing with devices. Are the devices adequate for the remote learning purposes? Yes or no? If the answer is no, then they should be eligible for funding. Now, what the FCC did is they said, well, we really don't have a specific way that we're going to require schools to go about determining this. They said, this started about a year ago when the pandemic was really, first hitting the scene. And we know that schools kind of approached this in a wide variety of ways and probably have a wide variety of information. So rather than requiring some sort of specific form or survey or something like that, we just sort of generally want people to document, how they sort of came to the understanding that these students here are not connected at home. And
so any informal documentation is going to work, or will satisfy the requirements?
Yeah, I think there's not necessarily that. It's kind of a catch-22. On one hand, we don't have really super detailed instructions that we can just follow, which some people think would be nice. But on the other hand, as long as we've got some documentation and they're being reasonable and upfront, there's not a whole lot they can do to say, hey, that's not right. Right. So I think that you have the sort of extremes, right, where, you just have a broad stab in the dark. Probably not the best idea. Right. But I think as long as you can kind of document your thought process and how you arrived at the numbers, generally speaking, you should be OK. We're seeing
what would be the worst case scenario? If you were wrong about the need and you applied, well,
I mean, there could be loss of funding. So, that could take a variety of forms. It could be that they review the application and they decide that you've over requested, we'll say, so we don't think that your count of students that are inadequately connected is correct. We think it's too high. They could just reduce the funding application. That's one thing that they could do. Potentially
still more than zero, right?
Still more than zero. Yeah.
Why not?
And there is a bit of risk there just is, and there is participating in E-rate as well. They could do an audit later on, come back after the fact and say, we felt like that we really shouldn't have committed that much money and now we want it back. They do actually have the legal authority to do that. Now, I don't want to be scary, I think that there's definitely kind of a happy medium there. I think if you've got 5,000 students enrolled and you're requesting 5,000 devices, I think you're probably going to get some questions about that, right? Are they going to say, really, is every single student in your district not connected to the internet?
As needs,
and that may well be the case. Who knows? And I think at that point, then it really would be, okay, what documentation are we able to save to sort of justify our position here? We see schools using surveys. I've heard that they're adding questions to enrollment forms this year. There's some technical measures too. I mean, we sent X number of kids home and, 3/4 of them were able to dial back in. And we identified the ones who were absent. Clearly there's some sort of issue there,
Oh, that's clever. So what did they send out to have them dial back in? This is a really clever strategy, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have online classes, right? Everybody needs to be logged in. If you've got students that really, are consistently not able to log in, then there must be some sort of issue there. And many, many times connectivity is the issue, especially if the school district knows that they've not assigned a device to that student, right? Or a hotspot, something like that. So we didn't send anything home and they're not able to call in. We assume that, there very well may be a technology issue there.
Well, when COVID hit, it was interesting. We did a survey of huge number of schools that represented about 10% of the kids in the country. And some of the stories that came back were just astonishing. I mean, we were looking at a lot of schools had maybe on average a 3-to-1 student to computer ratio when COVID hit. And there was a massive amount of purchasing that had to happen. And there was a massive amount of old garbage machines that went home. You know, the used, recycled, anything they could by hook or crook get donated just to get these kids something to get connected. Now, they, you know, if they managed 1-to-1, which many of our donors don't believe that there isn't a 1-to-1 ratio in our schools of students to computers, but there wasn't. We weren't even close to that when COVID hit. We were lucky if a school had 1-to-2, you know, we were lucky. But what's ended up happening now is that there's a lot of these old machines that are now in the home that are being used at, you know, can we go through like a systemic replacement? Let's say I'm a school that has gotten, you know, 6 different sources of donations. Can I apply for this ECF funding and just do an entire systemic replacement of all of those machines and get everybody back to ground zero, you know, on a student by student basis? How does that work with the qualifications?
Well, you know, you definitely could do some replacement of aging hardware with the funds from this program, absolutely. And the key really, it all goes back to the certification. So the interesting thing about the way that ECF is going to work and the way that E-rate works is you do a lot of self-certification. So whenever you file this application, you get to the end and there's all of these boxes that you have to check that you're compliant with all these various rules. And you know, when we talk about eligibility under this program, the specific certification you're making is that you are only seeking funding to provide devices or connectivity to students who would otherwise lack sufficient devices or connectivity to engage in remote learning. So it's actually sort of almost irrelevant whether that student has a device now or has a connection. It's really more the sufficiency of that. Certainly, if they don't have a device at all and they can't do any sort of remote learning because of that, that's easy, right? I mean, that obviously, you know, the funding for that student would qualify. But, you know, in my mind, exactly the same thing happens if you've got kids that have laptops that are 9 years old, right? You know, or
tablets and they need a full-on computer.
iPads, you know, that can't run the latest software and won't run on a battery. You know, all those sort of things that happen. You know, I think as long as that's the situation and they really can't effectively engage in remote learning, you know, then whether or not they have that device is sort of irrelevant. If remote learning is not possible, then they should qualify for funding under this program.
So you could do, you know, potentially an overhaul replacement if you have a lot of old equipment out there.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you know you kind of done your due diligence to identify those students who, you know, don't have any other options for connectivity or devices.
Yeah, the sufficiency thing is not is something new for all of the funds coming down. Talk about a little bit more about the discount rates and how that applied before and how it applies now, as well as, you know, anything else that's changed or is different from how E-rate used to work and how the new rules that are coming down the pipeline are changing things. Because we have a number of schools that think that they can't apply because they don't qualify or they don't have the staff to fill out the paperwork or, you know, any number of reasons. But there's some major differences here. There's changes in the rules that would allow many more schools to apply than used to. So talk about what's different.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big differences we kind of alluded to already is just that this is not a discount program. So E-rate is a discount program, which means that a school that applies for E-rate is always going to be paying some portion of the cost of the eligible products and services that they're
and they
purchasing.
pay that up front, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah, and it can range from 20% to 90%, just depending on socioeconomic levels and what types of services the school's buying. But in this case, all applicants qualify for payment of the full cost of the services, subject to the per device caps, right? And so in that regard, your E-rate discount rate for the purposes of ECF is almost irrelevant. So, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're a 20% school or whether you're a 90% school. In ECF, 100% of the costs of your eligible products and services are covered.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. What
Yeah.
about,
Oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
Well, you also
Vi-
mentioned sort of the application process. You know, the ECF program is going to use a modified version of the existing E-rate application. So and it's actually advantageous for a couple of reasons. Number one, it will look familiar to anybody who's applied for E-rate discounts in the past, but
A
it's
lot of
also
schools are scared of it, you know,
it's
they're,
also been simplified quite a bit, though, and that's kind of the nice thing. So the application itself has been approved by the Office of Management and Budget, so it's working its way through. But really, because of the way that the ECF is structured and the rules associated with it, there's a lot of information that's typically collected on E-rate applications that's not necessary for ECF applications. So they will be simpler, and a lot of the information that's collected on the form is pretty straightforward, should be things that are easy to lay your hands on, easy to understand. Fairly straightforward application.
so if a school is going to apply, do they apply at the same E-rate portal as before? Is it the same process with different checkboxes, or where do they go?
Yeah, some of those details are still being worked out, but we are almost certain that the current E-rate Productivity Center, or EPC, that's the online portal that USAC uses for E-rate applications. We assume they're going to be using that same portal for the ECF applications. The good thing about that is that a lot of the information that schools have already input will just carry right over. So they won't be doing a bunch of data entry that they've already done for their E-rate applications. It'll be, you know, kind of an integrated.
Oh, that's great.
Mhm.
Yeah. What about three bidding? If you've got your vendors lined up, do you have to go through the conventional three bid process? Or can you just say, oh, I'm going to be reimbursed 100%. I already know who my vendor is and I've just got my one and that's all I have to do.
Yeah, that bit depends entirely on what your own state and local rules are. So for the ECF program, the FCC imposed no competitive bidding requirements. Again, we talked about certifications. One of the certifications that schools will make is that they followed their own state and local procurement guidelines, whatever those happen to be. So some schools, just by nature of their own rules, may have to collect three bids to make a purchase like that, you know, just under normal circumstances. Sometimes you see things like purchase thresholds. If it's over a certain amount, it has to go out to bid. Sometimes there's emergency procurement rules that kick in cases like pandemics where they get a little bit more flexibility. So it really just sort of depends on what your school or library's purchasing process is. As long as you follow that, you'll be in good shape for ECF. So no competitive bidding like we have in E-rate with a Form 470 and a waiting period and evaluating bids and all of that. That's not a part of ECF.
That's new. That's great. Well, I want to emphasize that you have to play to win. So, you know, if anybody's out there watching and wants to know whether or not they should apply, you should just apply, because worst case scenario, what I'm, you know, most concerned about as Digital Wish, as a nonprofit, as trying to solve the digital divide, is what are we looking at if the money doesn't get applied for? What happens? What happens if only 1 billion gets applied for, or 2 billion, or 5 billion? Then there's still a bunch of money left in the fund. Where do we go from there?
Well, so the FCC has a couple of options. So we're going to have this initial filing application window. The first round, if you will, or the first window, will be for purchases that schools are going to make between July 1st of 2021 and June 30th of 2022. So that's the time period that they're looking at for this first window. So they'll submit funding applications for those purchases. And at the end, we'll sort of tabulate up and see how much money is requested. If it's not more than the $7.1 billion that's available, the FCC will decide what to do next. And they have a couple of options. They could open another window for a future time period. They could also open another filing window for retroactive reimbursement of costs that schools have already incurred. So what they did was they said, if we open this second window and we look backwards that time, we'll go all the way back to March 1st of 2020. And that'll work really kind of like a show me your receipts sort of situation, right? So we know what's eligible, the hotspots, the end user devices. We'll be gathering up the receipts where we purchased those things back during the pandemic and essentially turning those in to have them paid by this program.
So if somebody's out there watching and they need help with their application and they wanted to call Funds for Learning, how do they get in touch with you?
They can visit our website, fundsforlearning.com. That's FUNDSFOR learning.com. Right up at the top of our homepage, there's an ECF link, and you can click that. It's really super easy to book a consultation with our folks, and they'll be happy to walk you through the process. We're here to answer questions. We want to be as helpful as we possibly can. We do help schools and libraries through the E-rate and ECF process, but if you're going it alone and just have a couple of questions, we'd be more than happy to chat with you as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate you coming on. This has been Digital Wish, Solving the Digital Divide, and we will have many more episodes coming down the pipeline to help you get access to the money that you need and help schools apply for funding. And then when you get the equipment after the fact, to figure out how to effectively implement that and curriculum strategies and hardware strategies downstream. So thank you for attending. Keep your eye on digitalwish.org and watch for future episodes of Solving the Digital Divide. Go on out there and let's do it. Let's cross over the digital divide. Have a great day.